a nightmare. I mean, it was an economic disaster. Naomi Klein writes about it in her book, The Shock Doctrine. Philip Thayer wrote a very good book on it called Europe Since 1989. The life expectancy dropped very significantly. The infant mortality rate shot up. Mass unemployment, something like 30% unemployment. Can you imagine 30% unemployment? The 1990s in Russia was not doing well economically. And basically, what they had been told at the time that the Soviet Union was being dissolved was that, the United States was just going to let the Soviet Union transition to being a welfare state. That's not what happened. The Soviet Union got economically demolished. And I mean, we're talking, this is, the term used by Andre Gunder Frank, the US economist, he called it economic genocide because the population of Russia went down by 10% during this time. Now, it wasn't all deaths. Some of it was just people leaving. But it was, when the population of a country drops by 10% amid an economic collapse, that's bad. And that was what was happening in Russia at that time. And it was all of the illusions that the kind of the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party and the supporters of Boris Yeltsin had this illusion that somehow Russia would be allowed to transition to a more liberal system and continue to flourish economically. It was completely debunked. But the Western left was part of cultivating those illusions, right? And that's a very important thing to talk about. The Communist Party of the United States, was probably the main back channel that U.S. intelligence used to funnel this kind of disinformation into the Soviet Union. There's a very important book called Operation Solo that's written about Morris Childs. And Morris Childs was an FBI agent who infiltrated the Communist Party for the FBI. And he smuggled money into the United States and gave it to the Communist Party leaders, in suitcases, basically. And he was an FBI informer. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan for his work infiltrating the Communist Party. Now, back to the United States. In the lead up to the fall of the Soviet Union, all kinds of communists all over the world are saying something's wrong here. Right? Gorbachev gets up and says he doesn't believe in Marxism anymore. He doesn't believe in class struggle. He believes in, quote, universal human values. He gets up and says Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are good people and the Soviet Union likes them, and he's, everyone around the world is kind of raising the alarm bells. All British communists are speaking up. Dissident American communists are speaking up. Everyone's speaking up. The Communist Party of the United States says nothing about it. They just applaud it. And there was never any awareness about what was happening until the last minute. And at the last minute, when Gorbachev was arrested in the coup, at the last minute, Gus Hall finally came out and said, something's wrong. Gus Hall was the leader of the U.S. Communist Party, a longtime labor activist. He finally came out and said, okay, something is wrong. And at that moment, a number of members of the Communist Party immediately quit. I mean, there was mass resignations from the Communist Party. And a couple of years later, like 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had their national convention in Cleveland, Ohio. And at least half the membership walked out of the convention, including Angela Davis and a number of these people who were basically people who didn't believe in communism. They believed in kind of the social democratic liberalism. And it's apparent that they were being used by American intelligence to kind of cultivate a social democratic and liberal illusion among the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And, that is certainly a sore point for the Communist Party, the role that they played, the fact that the fall of the Soviet Union took them by surprise, and then a number of their members quit in support of Gorbachev. That's pretty big.
Yeah, it cut them all the way down to 500,000 members.
Well, just in the example of Angela Davis, you can see how her views transform over time.
It's interesting because, and I've talked about this too, the Communist Party, they did take the position of voting for the Democrats, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason they took that position was the feeling was the Democrats, they wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union. They wanted to sign, nuclear treaties, et cetera. And that Ronald Reagan and the escalation of the arms race was like the main threat. But that started out as a tactic. Supporting Roosevelt, in a popular front against fascism in the 1930s was a tactic, right? They did it not because they thought Roosevelt was a good guy, but it was a strategic decision that they made.
A means to an end.
Yeah, but what started out as a tactic kind of became a law because, it started out as a tactic for the grandparents, but then their parents just did that. They didn't know anything different. And now the people running the Communist Party, like Joe Sims, they've never done anything other than campaign for the Democrats. It's all they know how to do. In the 1930s, the Communist Party was very much a labor militant party. It was the party of militant labor activists, of black revolutionary intellectuals, etc. But, from about the 1960s onward, it becomes almost, I jokingly call it like the Soviet lobby. That often what would happen is you'd have like college kids, they'd go on a trip to Cuba because they want, adventure. They want to go to visit a socialist country. So they go to Cuba and they're blown away by the achievements of socialism and, free education and healthcare and workers running the factories and such. And so they find out that, that if they really want to help Cuba, when they come back to the United States, they ought to join this group called the Communist Party. So they join the Communist Party. And what does the Communist Party do? It campaigns like hell for the local Democrats. And it operates in secret, but it's made clear to the local Democrat that, hey, we're communists and we're campaigning like hell for you. And the idea is local Democrats will see this and say, wow, by golly, these communists have worked so hard for my campaign. Maybe I should, be lighter on the Soviet Union or something like that. It's kind of a failed strategy. And people compare it to almost how Israel lobbies, right? You have birthright trips to Israel. People go to Israel. They really like Israel. They get back to the United States, and then they're kind of plugged into like pro-Israeli activism in the United States, right? That's not what the Communist Party was intended to be. That's not what it was in the time of Lenin and Stalin, but that's what it kind of became. And the Black Panthers are kind of an exception to that. See, originally, the Communist Party denounced the Black Panthers as left adventurous terrorists when they first started doing their armed patrols, around police brutality. The Communist Party was freaked out and thought they were FBI provocateurs. But then after Richard Nixon was elected and COINTELPRO came down hard on the Communist Party and the Black Panthers were kind of fighting for their lives, essentially, being targeted by the FBI. At that point, the Black Panthers had a convention in California and entered an alliance with the Communist Party. And suddenly, that's when Angela Davis became friendly to the Black Panthers. And you had the Black Panthers and the Communist Party in like late 1969. They're cooperating with each other in response to heavy political repression from Richard Nixon. And that the Black Panther, Angela Davis, that was kind of the exception. The Communist Party behaved in a very reformist manner, but, Angela Davis, put on trial and acquitted in a very widely publicized trial. And then she had her committee against political repression and racism. And other than, some of their activism in terms of Black liberation was bold and revolutionary. But in a lot of ways, the Communist Party kind of functioned as this kind of liberal, this kind of group of liberals that lobbied in defense of the Soviet Union and were trying to convince Democrats that the Soviet Union wasn't so bad. And that was kind of the role that they played. And I think that led to a lot of confusion, I guess you could say. But also going on during this time, and again, we're coming at this from so many different angles here, was the anti-nuclear movement. And this is really important also. So nuclear power in the United States is tied up with the production of nuclear weapons, right? It's linked to each other. And it tends to be the military-industrial complex that favors nuclear power. Whereas the main opponent of nuclear power in the United States is the oil companies, because nuclear power will put them out of business, right? So there's kind of a divide with, the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundation. And, a lot of those folks are very opposed to nuclear power. They're also very opposed to the military-industrial complex, and they're funneling money to the CIA. So you have the CIA and big oil, on the one side, opposing nuclear weapons, opposing nuclear power. You have the military-industrial complex favoring an escalation with the Soviet Union, supporting nuclear power, supporting a nuclear arms race. There's kind of a division. And so you have the anti-nuclear movement that emerges. And in like the late 70s, during the Carter administration, suddenly you have people protesting against nuclear power. After the 3 Mile Island incident, and then later you have Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, you start having protests against nuclear power. And at first, the Communist Party says, okay, we're not against nuclear power. We just want public ownership of it. We don't trust private companies, which is probably the correct position.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way you would want that to go.
Right. We can't trust private companies with the health of the public. But, the idea that there's something inherently wrong with nuclear energy, that's not Marxism, right? People sitting up, you can't play God by splitting an atom. That's not Marxism, right?
That's silly idealism.
Right. But, the Communist Party eventually backs down from that position and just goes all in against nuclear power, because there's a feeling that Ronald Reagan and the military-industrial complex are the main threat. And so in the Soviet Union, you start having marches against nuclear power and against nuclear weapons sponsored by the Soviet Communist Party, by the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, by the government. on the same day as you have rallies in the United States against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And these marches basically equate the Soviet government and their nukes with the American government and their nukes. And it's kind of creating this idea that, we're on both sides are to blame, right? And that becomes a big liberal mobilization. And it's kind of an anti-science mobilization. It's saying there's something inherently wrong with nuclear energy. It's kind of Malthusian, right? We need to get back to Mother Nature. We need to get back.
Exactly. We always have to return to Monkey. When we get into that stuff, it's the Anprim crap, the anarcho-primitivist crap, the antinatalists, all these, like, just basically anti-human people will always come together and, like, advocate for a form of austerity in opposition to what is somehow an evil force, which in the 1980s, like you said, is nuclear.
Yeah, and so you had this situation where the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party that was becoming more and more reformist, and the U.S. Communist Party and leftists in the United States are basically playing off of each other in a way that ultimately leads to the dismantling of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union falls.